Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're looking at Valkmar chapter 14 today. This is right up my alley. We're talking about behavior management, and a lot of behavior management, most effective behavior management strategies come from the field of applied behavior analysis, and that happens to be what I have a master's and doctorate in. I teach an undergrad course, 449, that's I don't know if it's called behavior management or classroom management, but essentially these are the types of things we focus on. Of course, this is specific to behavior problems and behavior management for individuals with autism spectrum disorders. So these top, 5 bullets basically identify the types of behavior problems that we're going to think about most when we're talking about this population. The first is repetitive or stereotyped behavior. This is kind of the rocking and flapping, flapping of arms, flapping of fingers in the face, and that sort of thing. Challenging behaviors are typically self-injurious behavior and aggression, so they're either hurting themselves or hurting someone else. Rigidness and perseveration. These kind of there might be some unusual interests and that individuals perseverate on, and lining things up and following a routine. And I mean, not just a routine, but things like, you have the same thing for breakfast every Monday, or you arrange the snack table, in a particular order every time, or that sort of thing. And we'll talk about each of these individually, but this is just kind of our introduction and overview. The next is overactivity and problems with attention, impulsivity, bolting, running, that sort of thing. And then mood problems. We talk about depression and anxiety a lot. Something to think about in terms of the introduction is that behaviors do change over time. We see a lot of different things, but we see, a lot of changes from toddlers to adolescents to adulthood. Sometimes they become more severe, sometimes they lose the behavior, sometimes perseveration replaces stereotypy, that sort of thing. But it changes, so we have to think about where we currently are and the main focus for that. It says which to focus on. Usually you don't just have one type of challenging behavior with an individual with ASD. They travel in groups. You usually see many of them, and so you have to focus on, and typically focus on one or a couple versus all of them. So you have to think about which to focus on, how to prioritize, and we'll talk more about that throughout this lecture as well. And of course, the last bullet, when considering treatment, you must always weigh the potential benefits against the risks of treatment. And we'll talk more about that too, but basically we need to think about sometimes, for example, stereotypy. Parents and siblings might find it, embarrassing. Sometimes they find it embarrassing in public. And so that's something that they want to focus on and would like to reduce and that sort of thing. And we have to think about how problematic is it? Is it impeding educational programming? Is it causing the individual to not progress or not have independent skills and that sort of thing? So we have to really think about the behavior problems that are at hand, why we think it's important to intervene on them, and then if we are going to intervene, we really have to think about the benefits of the intervention or treatment that we're going to use, and make sure that those, of course, always outweigh the risks of it. So behavioral and educational interventions, those are usually the first type of treatment that are sought out. I know I say this somewhere else in the lecture, but medication is used as a first resource, typically only when the behavior is kind of an emergency situation, usually self-injury. I've worked with individuals who are poking their eyes so severely that they're damaging the cornea, and they'll have issues with vision and that sort of thing. And so some professionals have suggested medication is the first resource. I don't know if that's always my first resource. We can usually decrease behavior pretty quickly, but kind of just depends. It depends on the behavior, the individual, the circumstances, what the caregivers would like to see happen, and that sort of thing. But for the most part, behavioral and educational interventions are the first type of treatment that are provided. We know that assessment and intervention from applied behavior analysis is really proven to be very helpful. And kind of your beginning of your book talks about some main issues, and one is to not only pay attention to challenging behavior when it's occurring. So essentially under the notion that you're reinforcing the behavior by paying attention to it. And so you kind of see this in the classroom. You might go into a classroom and see that an individual might only get attention from the teacher when he pinches his classmate, or flaps his hands, or rocks back and forth, or grinds his teeth, or whatever it may be. But that's the only time that they're getting, touches and talking to and close proximity and that sort of thing. So just the general notion of we don't only pay attention to challenging behaviors when they're actually occurring. You want to have a vision of the positive behaviors that you want to replace those challenging behaviors with. And a great thing to do, great way to start, your text actually says, and I thought it was kind of funny, but it says become a detective. And I like the idea of that. Essentially, you start observing very meticulously, looking for regularities in the behavior. You can usually identify some things that occur commonly when you're talking about that behavior. So when it happens, it might be a specific, during a specific activity, after a specific activity, but it also might be in the presence of fluorescent lights, or it might be, something really specific. So you have to really start observing and paying attention. You have to see what happens before the behavior and what happens after the behavior. And this whole notion is thinking about antecedents and consequences. If you're in 844, I know you've talked about this. If you've been in 449, we've talked about this. But antecedents and consequences are really important to try and identify. Antecedent is what happens before the behavior, and so that's kind of the trigger, what happens before the behavior, and what happens after is the consequence. So what's maintaining the behavior? So there's lots of ABC charts and that sort of thing that you can use as well, but an easy place to start when you're thinking about managing behavior problems. One thing to keep in mind is that it's much easier to prevent problem behaviors than to react to them during a crisis. I've been in a lot of classrooms over the years, and sometimes I meet resistance in terms of, wanting to implement this big, lengthy, time-intrusive type of intervention for behavior management. And I always break it down to teachers that it's going to be less time implementing this intervention than it is reacting to the behavior on a regular basis. So just something to consider. Again, be a careful observer. Look for warning signs. That basically is, oftentimes you might see kind of cues or clues that an individual might engage in right before something really problematic. So an individual might start humming really loud or flapping their hands right before a severe aggressive burst out. So if you can identify those precursors, the things that are happening before the severe behavior, then you can intervene on those and not have to go full scale. So it's important to identify those. Always look at the environment, see if there's anything you can identify. We know the individuals on the spectrum respond pretty well to quiet, structured environments. So are there things in the environment that are problematic? Looking for the function of the behavior, again, 449, 844 are really helpful in helping you understand how to identify the function and then how to intervene based on the function of behavior. But really, the function is why is the behavior occurring? So what function does it serve? What is maintaining it? And typically, they're broken down into pretty straightforward domains. The function is usually to gain access to something. So it might be to a person, to attention, to an activity, to a tangible item, to food, or it might be to escape something. Say, escape a demand, escape an assignment, escape a classroom, or a person, or an environmental variable, whatever it happens to be. But typically, if you can identify that function of why the behavior is occurring, then we can replace the behavior with something more appropriate that still serves the same function. So a really easy one is if we have an individual that is engaging in problematic behavior like stereotypy or aggression or whatever it happens to be, to get attention from the peer, from the teacher, whatever it is, we can teach an alternative to get attention from peers and teachers. So we can teach social greetings, we can teach hand raising, we can teach a help card, all those sorts of things that will still serve the same function. The individual can still get attention from a peer or teacher, but they do it with appropriate behavior versus problematic behavior. So function is really important. We'll talk more about that in the Zager chapter as well, because it spends a good amount of time talking about how that relates to laws and things that are in effect that really require teachers and professionals to identify the function of behavior. Catch the child doing the right thing. A lot of schools do this, and actually when I was reading case study assignments and grading those, someone talked about a school where they kind of relied on the catch the child doing something good cards. But it's important because it sounds so simple and mundane, but oftentimes you'll forget to do it. I forget to do it with my own children. I respond to the fighting and tattling and that sort of thing, and forget to respond to the really polite manners and sharing and that sort of thing. So catch the child doing the right thing. If you have that in mind and think about it all the time, then you're constantly reinforcing appropriate behavior. The more you can reinforce appropriate behavior, the more it can occur, and the less that problematic behaviors will occur. Inappropriate behaviors are often reinforced by doing what encourages the behavior, and that just means, and if you read this paragraph in your text, it's pretty helpful. Essentially what they're saying is that inappropriate behaviors work really well for any individual, but individuals on the spectrum. If an individual is engaging in self-injury or aggression to basically escape the demands of reading time or math sheet or something like that, as soon as we do what the individual wants, as soon as we say, okay, this is too much for you, you don't have to do math right now, you don't have to go to reading group right now, then you've really just encouraged the behavior, right? So the individual goes, oh, okay, so all I have to do to get out of math and reading is, bite my hand or kick my neighbor or whatever it happens to be. Really, you see this everywhere. You ever stand in line at Target? Honestly, Meijer, I'm guilty of it, but you'll see parents that have their kids with them in line, and the kid is just whining and crying and complaining. They want the candy that's in the aisle, or they want the little princesses that are strategically placed at eye level for 3-year-olds. But the child is whining and crying, and they want it, and they want it, and so the parent finally just says, fine, you can have it, because then the whining and complaining and asking stops, and it works for the moment, and it worked really well for that child, and so the child will continue to do that in the lines and everywhere else. So it's pretty straightforward. Sensory is something that we can do with sensory, because I'm always really sensitive to the sensory issues. I know a lot of people want to decrease those right off the bat, and I'm sensitive to that because I think they really serve what we call kind of automatic reinforcement serves a function for the individual sometimes that's just internal. So we can look for appropriate replacements. Rocking is a really easy one. If an individual engages in rocking, we can teach the individual to rock in a rocking chair only. And then rocking chairs that are only in living rooms and only during bedtime routine. And so you can really provide alternatives for sensory without removing the feeling for the individual in terms of what that sensory is doing for the person. Another thing they talk about is give appropriate ways to communicate, and we've talked about this a lot, but honestly, you'll see a huge reduction in behavior problems if individuals can communicate. If you think about putting yourself in that position, not having any means to communicate your basic needs, your basic wants, that you're hungry, that you're tired, that your teeth hurt, that someone stepped on your foot, that, if you just don't have any means to communicate, what would you do? What kind of behaviors would you engage in? And so as soon as we can give an individual a means to communicate, a really easy one is a help card. You teach a help card, and they can ask for help and not have to engage in problematic behaviors. So again, hopefully this is kind of resonated throughout this course, and it will continue to. You have your language research articles, and it will definitely be a big piece of 845, which is assessment and intervention, but it's a really important one. The text lists some things that you want to avoid, and I thought I would just mention them because they're important. To avoid focusing on the negative, like we mentioned. A lot of times you want to avoid time pressure to the greatest extent you can, because that seems to kind of be a precursor to problematic behaviors. This one, there's a lot of individuals on the spectrum who are pretty hilarious and have a great sense of humor, but for the most part, you do want to avoid sarcasm and irony and complex humor, just for the sake of being clear and straightforward. Avoid being ambiguous, inconsistent, and of course unintentionally rewarding undesired behaviors. So, just some common themes from the chapter. And then of course always keep in mind that interventions have to be tailored to the child. It would be so much simpler if we could just list out some interventions and say apply these, but we have a huge range of individuals on the spectrum in terms of skills and deficits. Many different types of interventions for different types of behaviors, acquiring behavior and reducing behavior, and so of course the intervention has to be tailored to the individual. So the text basically starts with the first intervention as drug interventions, and medications can play a role in helping behavioral difficulties. It might be, like I said, that it's an emergency with head banging or whatever the case is, and so there'd be a quick and dirty type of intervention as drug intervention. What seems to be really effective are the combination of medicines and behavioral treatments. Young children are least likely to be recipients of drug intervention. And your text also talked about depression again, in terms of we do have some effective drugs for controlling depression in any individual, and works the same for individuals on the spectrum. The next is stereotyped behaviors and agitation. These are behaviors that seem purposeless. They're repetitive movements. They're often associated with self-injury and aggression, rigidness. We often see that these are occurring when there's some degree of agitation or the individual being on the edge. We see that it's kind of comforting. If you look, I wish we were in the classroom right now, because when I'm teaching in the classroom, I see all types of stereotypy happening. shaking of legs and playing with pencils and biting on pencils and thumbing hair and that sort of thing. It's actually a lot less now because people are on computers, and so they've got their hands busy and that sort of thing. But during test taking and that sort of thing, I see a lot of what would really be considered stereotypy. So anyway, we see this occurring when there's some degree of agitation and it seems to produce some kind of relaxation for the individual. We see that usually there's an unusual interest, the lights, twirling, spinning, taste or feel of things, that sort of thing, might be present and come before stereotype behaviors. So just something that we know is kind of down the road. Movements vary over the short and long term. They change. Like I said, they may serve as relaxation. Sometimes they do cause distress or embarrassment or whatever it is for parents and siblings in public. And so we have to determine if it actually does interfere with educational programs. And we can learn to confine the behaviors to a particular time and place, which we talked about. There's even a lot of you know a lot of these. You use them in your classroom. But, sensory balls and fidget seats and all kinds of things that can help provide an alternative for the individual. And so we see a reduction in those behaviors. But as you'll see with all the behaviors we're going to talk about in this chapter, it's important to identify when the behavior occurs, what sets off the behavior, what's the function of the behavior. And once you do that, it's a little bit easier to be able to identify an intervention and have a successful intervention in place. Movement and vigorous physical activity do seem to help. And so that's important to keep in mind because, even in elementary school, it's really the focus is on sitting and sitting still, and movement is for, those 15-minute, 30-minute recesses and lunch and that sort of thing. So providing additional movement and really vigorous physical activity can help reduce stereotypy and agitation. An important thing is to always rule out any medical issues that might be in place first. Anytime you see a major change in behavior from an individual not engaging in these type of behaviors to all of a sudden engaging in them, it's worth a trip to the doctor. I know it's listed somewhere else in this PowerPoint, but we commonly see head banging when there are ear infections, sinus infections, bronchitis, that sort of thing. Grinding and head banging, biting, a really common one for adolescents and older are impacted wisdom teeth. So you really have to identify if there's any medical issue that's at hand first, because sometimes, again, it's a means of communication. They're in pain, and so this is their way of, dealing with the pain or trying to communicate that they're in pain. Aggression and self-injury. And your text talks about this, and this is what I typically see is aggression is kind of precipitated by an event or a person for the most part. It's like, you disrupt their routine, and so then they'll be aggressive. If you place demands on them that are really hard for them, you'll see aggression. But you don't typically see aggression for the sake of aggression, for the most part. But anyway, aggression and self-injury, this is when we see injury to the self or others, and it's really most problematic for the people who are around the individual with ASD, the large majority of the day, teachers and parents and that sort of thing. Of course, to the individual if it's self-injury. Self-injury we see in the form of head banging, pinching, pulling out their hair, poking the eye, biting the hand, really common ones. Aggression, biting, scratching, hitting, head-butting, I was in a school for a while where, oh, he was so big too. He was about 16. He was well over 6 foot, well over 200 pounds, and his main form of aggression was headbutting, and he had broken the nose of a couple teachers by the time that I had come in. So anyway, in a form of aggression. So again, onset should warrant a visit with the pediatrician anytime that you see, or family doctor, or whatever, any kind of medical visit. Like I said, infected ears is a really common one in the young ones, and impacted wisdom teeth in the older ones. Again, this is going to seem really repetitive because you're going to hear it over and over when we talk about each type of behavior, but a really careful analysis of what seems to set the behavior off. Are we only seeing the behavior at school and not at home? Then that tells us a lot. Is it only in one class? Well, then we can really narrow it down. With one person, a really good thing is basically start with the WH questions. When, where, what, who, when's it happening, where's it happening, who's it happening with, that sort of thing. You can get a lot of information and really narrow it down. You'll find that it's not typically just sporadic and random, that you're going to see some common themes across that. Again, if behavior is really dangerous, medication might be used immediately. I'm always really cautious in saying that because I'm a behaviorist, and I use behavior analysis and behavior management strategies. So that, of course, is my first choice. But depending on the severity of the behavior and the situation, sometimes medication is called for. Aggression, this is what I was talking about, occurs when the child is frustrated, unable to communicate, their routine is violated, you interfere with the behavior. That's typically when you see aggression. So I was just saying, you don't see aggression for the sake of being aggressive for the most part. And again, lack of communication leads to aggression. It would in us, right? A lack of communication, not being able to communicate, being frustrated, and resulting in aggression. Rigid and perseveration, we see unusual interests, ritualistic, compulsive behaviors, problems with transition, an insistence on the sameness, and really what we seem to see is that this insistence on sameness is serves a purpose. It allows the individual to not have to deal with the complexity of change, right? It's much easier to understand the world and the world around you when things are the exact same. When the routine is same, when you know what to expect, you know the way things are going to look and what people are going to wear, it's much easier. So it serves a function. Some strategies that are kind of listed in terms of helping with these types of behaviors, visual schedules we've talked a lot about, but are really helpful. And you can teach individuals to tolerate change gradually. We always did this in the center that I ran for individuals with ASD, basically making sure that everything in the environment was always different, very gradually. Morning routine, we would typically get the student from the car and bring them into the school, and so we would do different things where first it would just be a different person that comes to the car, which that can be pretty problematic for an individual with ASD. We might go in a different door, and we might take a different route down the hallway, and whatever it is, but learning to tolerate change gradually. That your text gives some ideas for, well, I think they use the one where you can give like 3 different cards, and on each of them is a different surprise. And at first you start with like 3 things that the individual will think are fantastic. So any of those surprises they'd be pretty excited about, Hey, surprise, it's reading time, but instead you get 30 minutes on your favorite video game. And so learning that change might be to their benefit or it might be enjoyable. So scripts and verbal routines can be really helpful for higher functioning individuals. Social stories and providing rules can be really helpful. So those are some of your basic strategies. And again, we've talked about this before, but just making sure that there's a differentiation between this type of behaviors of individuals with ASD is different than the types of behaviors that occur with individuals that have OCD. And kind of the one that they always talk about is individuals with OCD who are engaging in similar types of behaviors wish they weren't. They really don't enjoy them and are problematic and typically eventually seek out help for them. Whereas individuals on the spectrum really enjoy their behaviors and could spend all their time doing those behaviors and don't see them problematic at all. Attention and overactivity, kind of taking the form of not listening, bolting, jumping, running, all those sorts of things. There's this issue with higher functioning individuals. It basically looks like ADHD, and so we're always kind of unsure what to do with that in terms of does it require an additional diagnosis of ADHD in addition to Asperger's. And so it's just kind of a hot topic thing that excuse me, typically comes up. Something important, just like all the others, is again to determine when it occurs. Is it at school or class specific? And these are the things to consider. Maybe the language demands are too high, and so the individual will not pay attention. The academic material is too hard, so they don't focus. Classroom environment can be problematic. Visual supports or augmentative communication systems can be really helpful. When you're thinking about when does it occur, fatigue is often sometimes an issue. Does it only occur late in the day? Is that because the student's already been sitting for 5 hours during the day and they need to jump and run and that sort of thing? Or is it that they're tired and it's been 5 hours and it's hard to pay attention at this point? And so another thing to identify is what motivates the child. So what does the child find really interesting? And this can be really helpful. I can't remember which text it is now. I'm pretty sure it was Volkmer, but it was a fun story about an individual that that would bolt. It must have been Volkmer, but the student on the spectrum would always take off, and the whole school personnel would search and look for him, and eventually they would find him down in the basement checking out the furnace, because that's what he found really interesting and perseverated on and that sort of thing. And the janitor always found it really irritating because he was interrupting him and what he was doing and that sort of thing. And of course the teachers found it very disruptive and that sort. And so they used that as motivation. So some kind of system was put in place in terms of if the individual engages in X or completes whatever assignments or pays attention for this long or whatever it happens to be, earns whatever many tokens. Actually, I think that's what it was in your text, is that he would receive like a red poker chip for paying attention for a period of time. And if he could get 6 poker chips by the end of the day, because there were 6 classes or whatever, he could go downstairs and check out the furnace for 10 minutes before he went home with the janitor. And what ended up happening is that the janitor and the student formed a really nice relationship, and the janitor served different purposes for the individual on the spectrum. But identifying what's motivating to the child, you can then use that to manage behavior. And again, it just lists medicines that are similar to ADHD can be helpful when we're talking about this type of behavior. So those stimulants that they prescribe for ADHD sometimes can be helpful with managing these same types of behaviors in individuals on the spectrum. Sometimes it does just the opposite, but luckily those aren't long-term effects or anything. Mental health and behavior problems. Typically, we see this more often with verbal and high-functioning individuals on the spectrum, but we do see anxiety, depression, and tendencies of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Your book goes into a lengthy discussion about psychotherapy, counseling, and cognitive behavior therapy as options. I think that's just a personal decision that the family would have to make, and I haven't been in a position as a school professional to seek out those types of services for the individual. Cognitive behavior therapy, though, some things that fall under that are like the social stories and scripts and that sort of thing. So you might use those types of strategies. I just listed a couple sites for you. The first one, I actually have not seen all of these, but I ran across it a while back and I just bookmarked it and saved it. Dr. Mack's behavior management site, and it has just free podcasts and training videos and that sort of thing. I've clicked on a few of them, like these, developing a comprehensive classroom management system, setting up classroom routines, designing and organizing your classroom. So feel free to check those out and feel free to give me feedback on them, because like I said, I haven't watched them thoroughly. I've just run across them and peeked at them and seen bits of them and that sort of thing. So it'd be neat if you did have time to look at those and give me any kind of feedback on those that you might have. The other one is this, and this is your participation for the week. These are the IRIS. This is the IRIS Center, and in the announcements, I provide a description of what I'd like you to do. But basically, I want you to spend some time just checking out the website and looking at this. This is the IRIS Resource Locator. It's free. Let's see, where's the... Well, I guess it doesn't matter. There's different types of resources that are available for researchers, for teachers, for whoever you happen to be. And so what I wanted you guys to do was look at, press all topics, and then press on these modules, and you'll see these are all different modules that are available free through IRIS. I actually assign these in a lot of my classes. I didn't assign them in 843. I'm pretty sure a student actually reminded me of these. But anyway, so if you click on Addressing Disruptive and Non-Compliant Behavior Part 1, Understanding the Acting Out Cycle, what you do is you go through this module of the challenge, thoughts, so forth. And so if you look at these, they can be really helpful. If you click on challenge, the first thing you're going to see is a video.
Before this school year began, Ms. Rollison, a beginning teacher, was feeling overwhelmed at the thought of dealing with behavior problems in her classroom. Now that school is well underway, she's figuring out ways to maintain control. And much of this is thanks to the opportunity she had to learn and apply her new knowledge about classroom management.
So anyway, you go through each one of these, and it ends up, providing points for discussion and things to think about, and an assessment piece, and so they're really helpful. I've always gotten really good feedback on these, and there are so many different types of modules available. So anyway, on your participation, what I want you to do is spend some time on here, check some things out. Diversity, interesting, because we don't see a lot of this in the textbooks for ASD. This site, IRIS, is not specific to ASD. It's just for any individual. But a lot of textbooks in ASD don't have specific sections on diversity. So anyway, I digress. But anyway, what I want you to do is to look at all topics, modules, check out all these different modules. Obviously not do all of them. Obviously you only have to do one of them. I just want you to look around, identify some things that are really helpful to you, and you can look at these kind of things, the activities, the podcasts, whatever it happens to be. And then I put up a discussion forum for you, and you can post what you found to be most helpful on the site. What I'm hoping is that some people come across different things that other people didn't see. So if you're reviewing what somebody else wrote, you might go, oh, that does sound really good, and I didn't even see that. So anyway, it's a pretty helpful resource. It's a free resource, and it's a huge initiative. They have a big grant to do this work, and they'll come and do training at anywhere, at schools, at sites, at MSU, anywhere, for a fee, of course, but using what's available on that website is all a free resource. Okay, I think that's it for that chapter. Take care. Talk to you guys soon.